Große willkommen in einem meiner Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 31 of my Star Trek The Original Series timeline analysis series of videos. In this video I'll discuss what we know about how space contact or combat was conducted in the original series scripts and episodes. For this video, I'm only looking at the original series scripts. I'll not be using any of the examples of space combat from later series. I tend to feel later series tried to make their space battle exciting by trying to show both combatants on the same screen, which results in some rather impressive manoeuvring, but gives us an unrealistic view of how space combat probably could occur. It's possible this could be justified somehow, but in the original series script, space combat was closer to traditional battleship engagements of World War I or World War II. So let's look at that in more detail. For this video, I'm using the version of Star Trek The Original Series which used enhanced CGI, simply because you can see more, and they were trying to duplicate the original vision as much as possible, so I have to assume it's reasonably accurate. As this will be more a visually based video, I'll go through the episodes when some form of ship-to-ship combat did occur only. Our first example is in the episode Corbomite Maneuver, when the Enterprise destroys the first Federation probe. The probe seems to be very close to the Enterprise. Later we discover the scripts imply all distances are 1,000 times greater than what we see on the screen. When the probe began to become dangerous, the Enterprise fired phasers and destroyed it, and at unusually close range, which impacted the Enterprise in some minor manner. I suspect this type of close-range engagement was not typical. Our next engagement occurs in the episode Balance of Terror. Initially, the Romulan spacecraft hit an Earth outpost, which was apparently heavily defended both physically and with deflector shields. It took 2 shots from the Romulans to destroy the base. In the next engagement in the same episode, the Enterprise fires phasers in a blind pattern against the cloaked Romulans. This damages the Romulans, but allows the Romulans to return fire. In the next attack, the Romulans decloak and launches its powerful weapon, or fires its powerful weapons, probably a super photon torpedo. At this point in the series, the Enterprise was not launching photon torpedoes. That came in later series. Perhaps this episode gave them the idea for this weapon type. The Romulan is probably a significant distance away based on the previous manoeuvring and how long it takes for the photon torpedo to arrive. The Enterprise then does some more blind firing. The phasers blasts seem to be exploding, so I suspect that these could be actually photon torpedoes rather than phasers, even though they're referred to as phasers. Remember, at this point in the series, the whole concept of photon torpedoes didn't exist. The Romulans then jettison debris, which includes an old-type atomic warhead. This must have got reasonably close to the Enterprise, and when it exploded, it damaged the Enterprise. In the final engagement, the Enterprise just manages to fire their exploding phasers just before the Romulans can destroy the damaged Enterprise. The Romulan ship is intact and later self-destructs. The first mention of photon torpedoes occurred during the episode Arena. However, there is no ship-to-ship combat during this episode. In the episode Errant of Mercy, the Enterprise is ambushed by a cloaked Klingon spacecraft, which first fires a number of photon torpedoes against it. The Klingon was a reasonable distance away, but was closing. The Enterprise fires back with phasers and destroys the Klingon. I have to assume this is a small Klingon vessel, similar to a submarine, let's say, which operates by remaining hidden. The Enterprise is simply too powerful for it once it becomes visible. Also in the episode, at Errant of Mercy, a Klingon and Federation fleet are about to engage. I estimate about 8 capital ships on each side with supporting spacecraft. The Organians stop this, so there is no combat in this episode. There is some combat in the episode The Doomsday Machine, but standard tactics do not apply in this case. In the episode The Changeling, the Enterprise is struck by a very powerful weapon, similar to a 90-photon torpedo weapon. I find this unlikely, as it would make the Enterprise invulnerable if it could survive such a blast, so let's just say it was powerful and caused the Enterprise severe issues. Combat was not standard in this case as well. In the episode Journey to Babel, the Enterprise engages in battle with a suicide vessel. Once again, the attacks seem to occur from some distance from the Enterprise. In the episode Ultimate Computer, we get our best example of spacecraft combat. In the first engagement, the Enterprise turns to face its targets and fires phasers. The distance is reasonable, but it's not thousands of kilometres away. I calculate about 2 kilometres based on this image. The ships need to face their target, which I do find rather interesting. Later we get a reference which indicates the distance shown on the screen is not correct. You need to multiply any distance calculated by looking at the CGI, which is what I did, by 1,000 to get something close to the actual distance. If this is correct, then the distance between the two craft in this example is 2,000 kilometres, which does sound actually reasonably plausible. Back to the episode, The Ultimate Computer. After being hit, the target turns and moves away, with the distance getting to the point the vessel is almost not visible. As these spacecraft are very large, being 330 metres long, this is probably a very long way away. Based on my imperfect math, I suspect about 35 kilometres away based on the image. However, you need to multiply this by 1,000, so the distance in this case is probably 35,000 kilometres. In the next attack, a poor old freighter is destroyed by photon torpedoes. I'm unable to assess its distance, but I suspect the distance is greater than the previous 35-kilometre distance identified, or actually 35,000 kilometres if multiplied by 1,000. As the freighter cannot avoid or fire back, this is probably reasonable. In the next attack, the Enterprise destroys a starship. Worst case of error since the British sunk their flagship in the Mediterranean before the 1900s. The distances here are less than 35 clicks, perhaps 20 to 15 kilometres. Once again, once we multiply these visual cues by 1,000, we get the distance which aligns with the script. So 15,000 kilometres to 20,000 kilometres is the actual distance in this case. In the final attack, the 3 surviving starships adopts this formation. As there is only one target, I suppose there is not much manoeuvring and positioning required. As this is in a viewer, and I have no references, I can't tell how far away these spacecraft are. I assume a reasonable distance, or at least outside engagement range initially. I wonder why photon torpedoes are not used. Perhaps when fired at long distance they can be dodged or destroyed somehow, so there's no point doing so. In the episode Elan of Troyes, the Klingons attack the Enterprise. The Klingon ship turns around to face the Enterprise. As we've seen in previous episodes, this must be a high level of magnification. In the latter passes, the Klingon ship closes to a range of about 30,000 kilometres from an initial range of about 500,000 kilometres. In another pass, the Klingon attempts to come around to the Enterprise flank. Clearly there's some advantage in doing so. I'm uncertain what type of weapon this is, probably a phaser. It's interesting the Klingons get 2 phaser banks as well, but they are separate, unlike the Enterprise where they all seem to be clumped together. In this engagement, the distance is likely initially 100,000 kilometres, and then it closes to a distance of about 30,000 kilometres, which is considered as close range for photon torpedoes. The Klingon does get a bit closer before firing phasers, perhaps 20,000 kilometres, if not closer. The Enterprise responds with photon torpedoes, damaging the Klingon spacecraft. There is some ship-to-ship combat in the episode The Enterprise Incident, but it's an unusual situation, so I'm not going to cover it. Let's now come to some kind of conclusion concerning these script references. Luckily, we get some actual distances for some of the engagements. 500,000 kilometres is too far for any weapon to be effective, while 30,000 kilometres is considered a short range for photon torpedo. The Klingon comes in closer before firing their weapon, phasers. Let's assume that weapon was a phaser. So phasers need to be fired closer than 30,000 kilometres. Perhaps they need to be fired from about 20,000 kilometres away. This means the visual representation of the ships engaging each other bears little resemblance to reality, and actually is closer to, old movies showing the sinking of the Bismarck or something of that nature, where the target is way off into the distance. The other interesting point here is that there is actually a surprising amount of manoeuvring. When the Enterprise was only using impulse, it was at a severe disadvantage against the Klingon, with the Klingon buzzing around trying to get in on the Enterprise's flank. If the distance is 100,000 kilometres, then at light speed you can cover that in a third of a second. If the ships are using warp, then lots of manoeuvring may be reasonable, but at 400 times the speed of light, you better be quick. Perhaps when you need to turn, you actually need to drop speed dramatically. We'll discuss what I think the drives actually are and why I feel this may be the case. As combat at multiples of light speed causes so many issues, I personally feel it cannot possibly occur. There must be something else here that makes this viable. The next point is the spacecraft fired their main weapons, which I assume is phasers, forward only. Let's assume phasers are large and bulky and grouped together into banks of two is a typical arrangement. This places them on many positions. Thus, placing them on many positions on a starship may make no sense because you can't get multiple phasers onto a single target easily. The Klingons fire their phasers from their wingtip, one per wingtip. I assume these are engine nacelles, which contains their main engines and energy generating capacity, so this may be a physical reason. Photon torpedoes can be fired from the rear, although I'm uncertain if there's any case of that occurring in the original series script. It was in the Star Trek motion picture, but there's no evidence of this in the original series. So let's say this is possible, but if it is possible, it is unusual and very rarely done. Let's now discuss the drive or propulsion system. First, let's cover what it cannot be and what it cannot be is an Alcubierrean warp drive. If a spacecraft was able to basically create a black hole to its front and an anti-black hole or negative energy or negative gravity to its rear, it would have no need for phasers or photon torpedoes. Let's assume the spacecraft would generate the amount of energy a small star generates in order to create these distortions in space. All it would need to do is ram the enemy and poof, it's all over. It'd be possible for a spacecraft to destroy a small moon by bumping into it. Putting aside the practicalities, that is not what we are actually seeing in Star Trek. What we really need is what I call a MacGuffin drive for Star Trek, which does not use much energy and cannot be used as a weapon. If you wish to try and use some real science, perhaps one way of doing this is that the drive simulates inflation. Not the type which makes it hard to pay the bills, but the type which is causing everything to travel away from each other in the universe. If you had a MacGuffin drive which creates deflation in front of your ship and inflation in the rear, you could do something similar to an Alcubierrean warp drive, which would require the energy of a small sun. Creating inflation or deflation may be possible. It may be possible to create that with far less energy, although this is only the case because we know nothing about this phenomenon. There is a good case to suggest inflation may not be even real, but let's assume it is. An inflation-based warp drive could not be used as a weapon, as inflation does not appear to affect matter. A deflation and inflation would simply pass over the matter. Some scientists have theorized if inflation becomes extreme enough, we may all fly apart, but this is only a guess, and a guess we'll ignore for the moment. If you only had deflation, you could end up with a black hole or an anti-black hole around it, which for argument's sake requires huge amounts of energy, which the starship probably does not possess. As a result, I doubt our deflation-inflation drive can create black holes or anti-black holes, which would be required if you want to use them as weapons. Let's quickly analyse how we would actually move using such a inflation-deflation warp drive. The first point to understand is you need some form of forward velocity to actually move, although you do sort of jump when the drive is on, that is physically jump locations. In this example, when you turn the drive on, you move forward, let's say in this case 300,000 kilometres instantaneously. This is great, except when you turn the drive off, you jump back to your original start position. Perhaps useful as a weapon, but by itself you're not going to go anywhere using this drive in this manner. You actually need to move or have normal velocity to move through the deflated space to actually move when the drive is turned off. If velocity remains the same, irrespective of the level of inflation or deflation, then moving 1 kilometre per second in your deflated space would move you 1 kilometre in 1 second. But when you turn off your drive, you would now be 300,000 kilometres forward of your original position. In the top, the drive is off, but we're moving at 500 kilometres per second. We then turn the drive on, and after 1 second, we advance 500 kilometres in our deflated space. Then we turn the drive off. We have now moved forward 150,000 kilometers in 1 second in this case. To advance forward, we would probably turn off and turn it back on allowing us to travel 150,000 kilometers in 1 second again. Repeat and rinse and repeat. If our velocity was 1,000 kilometers per second, we would be moving at speeds of 300 million kilometers per second, or 1,000 times the speed of light. Thus, we achieve our higher FTL speeds by achieving real high speeds and deflating, inflating a greater amount of space. Perhaps this maximum amount of space which we can deflate is 500,000 kilometers, which is outside any form of weapon range. Weapon range could be linked to the size of the deflation in front of the spacecraft. I doubt if this is reality, so don't try and get too scientific on me, but at least we have a pseudo explanation for our MacGuffin drive. This does bring up an interesting point, in that warp level represents the amount of deflation which is occurring and not any speed. Thus, warp 7 may deflate 300,000 kilometers into 1 kilometer, allowing a ship to travel at 1,000 kilometers per second to traverse 300,000 kilometers in 1 second, which is 100 times the speed of light. If the ship was moving at 500 kilometers a second, it would move less. If it was faster, it would move more. This allows Kirk to jump around Federation space in such a short period of time. He can move further under Warp 7 by simply having greater forward velocity, which may take a lot more time to build up and a lot more time to slow down, but at least it may be possible to have short, very long-range jumps. But there is an issue which limits this, or perhaps it's dangerous over long periods of time, so you can't do it very much, and it has to be done really only as a last resort. I feel this may be related to the system the Enterprise achieves forward velocity. That's where the risk factor comes in. The next point to consider is gravity. In the world of Star Trek, we must have some ability to control gravity, otherwise everyone would just turn to mush when the spacecraft turn, especially the rapid manoeuvring for space battles. But even if the warp drive compensated for this, everyone is still walking on the ground in space, so gravity control must exist. If Star Trek can control gravity, it could create 1g in front of the spacecraft and it would accelerate accordingly, giving it a perfect ability to move around in real space. Remember, in warp or even FTL impulse, we're only jumping because we're warping space. By itself, this does not give us sustained movement. We actually need real sustained movement to get anywhere. If using an Alcubierrean warp drive, you automatically get forward momentum. The black hole in front pulls you and the anti-black hole in the rear pushes you. I now wonder how to stop, as I suspect this type of drive would get you up to light speed pretty quickly. I suppose you need to reverse the drive in order to slow down. But anyway, I'm pretty certain we're not dealing with an Alcubierrean warp drive in Star Trek. The deflation-inflation drive does not automatically give you forward motion. You need to do something else. A gravity drive makes sense. 1g in front of the ship would allow you to accelerate at 1g. You could reach a velocity of 1,000 kilometers per second in 38 hours. If your drive multiplies speed by 300,000, we can travel just over 1,000 times the speed of light. If our 500,000 kilometer limit applies, the maximum we can deflate space is 500,000 kilometers into 1 kilometer. So 300,000 kilometers seems like a reasonable compromise. If this is correct, then ships accelerate, decelerate, and turn at 1g. Perhaps they can go a bit higher, but not probably much higher. This gives us nice terms. This gives us our nice terms, which we see when ships come into attack in the episodes. It also means the ships can't get too close, otherwise their turn circle would not allow them to get away. Now we come to why this type of drive and its speeds may limit our overall speed when we travel through space. 1,000 kilometers per second is very fast. If we hit something at that speed, we would experience a significant event. It's not relativistic speed, as it's only 1/3% the speed of light, but if something hits us fast enough, it's still pretty bad. Shields would be required to protect the ship. In an early episode of Star Trek, the shields are called meteor deflectors or something along those lines. That may be the original purpose of shields, for high-speed travel. That's real high-speed travel. In normal space, even a weak shield would be okay, but when we travel through deflated space, we are now compressing 300,000 kilometers of matter into 1 kilometer. We would be ploughing into a lot of matter, which would require more powerful shields. I suspect the speed limit is related to this. As your warp increases, the amount of matter you need to push through increases, increasing the loads on your shield. Long-term, very high-speed warp travel at high velocity simply overloads your shields, which I suspect is the reason why Voyager cannot just keep on accelerating at warp 8 until they come home for tea. Now we come to the weapons. If spacecraft are flying around at 100 times the speed of light, no photon torpedo or phaser will ever hit anything unless we use a deflation-inflation drive which affects a reasonable amount of space around it. A photon torpedo travelling at 0.5 the speed of light would still hit a target with deflated space in front of it, as the photon torpedo is also being affected by the deflated space. It would actually move much quicker as it's moving through deflated space, which could be the reason why the ships need to face each other in order to fire weapons. If they fire into inflated space in the rear of spacecraft, everything moves slower. If the inflated space is being affected by the attacking deflated space, the weapons move faster, but the two overlapping deflated spaces would give us, or deflated inflated spaces, would give us our maximum speed. Of course, I am referring to speeds relative to someone outside the deflated inflated space. It's important to note that within your deflated or inflated space, you can never exceed the speed of light. Now, I have no idea if this makes sense, but we need to allow weapons which are light speed, such as phasers, and high speed, such as photon torpedoes, to be able to hit our targets, which are theoretically moving at hundreds of times the speed of light. We also need some way of seeing our targets, as travelling at 400 times the speed of light should not permit you to be seen if travelling directly at a target. There could be reasons why spacecraft battles occur at reasonably short distances. Everyone needs to be affected equally by the inflation-deflation drives, with some averaging out. In this situation, the actual manoeuvring is being conducted by the gravity drive. Everyone is in a warped bubble when they are using FTP drives, faster-than-light drives. This shows a possible example. At the top, the FTL drives are off. When both drives are on, both ships now move very close to each other and everything within the combined deflated space is equally affected. This means when fighting, both fleets are effectively fighting at normal sublight speeds. Although if your enemy did not have an FTL drive, they would be at a massive disadvantage, as an attacker could buzz around using their FTL drive, avoiding enemy weapons and projecting their photon torpedoes and phasers forward so fast no response would be possible. But with both sides possessing an FTL drive, this advantage is lost and we are now in a bubble of deflated space, which acts the same as normal space within it, except positioning becomes incredibly important. There are more unanswered questions and solutions in this explanation, but the space battles of Star Trek just don't align with the reality we know. Personally, I would force everyone to leave FTL for battle, but that's not the world of Star Trek, and in this pseudo-normal space, where both sides are using FTL, is a good compromise to resolve the problem. I'm inspired to think of some board game mechanic which allows me to fight out some of the major battles of the Star Trek The Original Series world. There would have been several during the Earth-Romulan War and at least 3 for the latter Federation-Klingon War. And so we come to an end of this episode 31 of my Star Trek The Original Series Timeline Analysis series of videos, in this case discussing space combat. The episode guides or episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.